With $30,000 in medical debt and her mother's cancer treatment hanging in the balance, Zara Williams is counting down the hours until her body gives out from exhaustion. She never expected that collapsing in the emergency room would land her in the arms of Park Ji-won, Seoul's most dangerous crime boss, who sees something in her dedication that makes him want to offer protection she desperately needs. At 24, Zara balanced the crushing weight of nursing school with triple shifts at Seoul General Hospital's night clinic. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she moved between patients, her scrubs wrinkled from 18-hour days, her natural hair pulled back in a simple bun that had long since given up any pretense of neatness. Dark circles shadowed her warm brown eyes, and her hands shook slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep. She was practical, focused, and knew the exact value of every dollar she earned because every dollar meant another day her mother might live. Her phone buzzed with a text from the oncology ward. Mom's next treatment cycle would cost $12,000. Insurance covered 60%. The remaining $4,800 was due by Friday, or they would have to delay treatment for 2 weeks. 2 weeks her mother couldn't afford to lose. You know what's really frustrating about medical debt? Zara thought as she checked her bank balance on her phone screen. $347.62. That was everything. 6 months of working every available shift, of skipping meals, of sleeping in hospital break rooms to save on transportation costs, and she had less than $400 to show for it. Zara moved through the emergency department with mechanical precision, checking vitals, administering medications, updating charts. Her supervisor had praised her efficiency, her calm under pressure, her ability to handle the worst trauma cases without flinching. What she didn't know was that Zara had no choice but to be efficient. Every minute wasted was money lost, and money lost meant her mother's time running out. The automatic doors burst open at 2:30 in the morning. Zara looked up from the supply cart she was restocking to see 3 men in expensive dark suits carrying a 4th man between them. The injured man's left shoulder was soaked in blood, his face pale but conscious, his dark eyes alert and calculating despite his obvious pain. Even bleeding and supported by his associates, there was something commanding about his presence, something that made the entire emergency department go quiet. He was Korean, probably mid-30s, with sharp features and black hair styled perfectly despite his current situation. His suit was custom-tailored, the kind that cost more than Zara made in 6 months, and even torn and bloodied, it spoke of wealth and power that didn't belong in a public hospital emergency room. His associates were equally well-dressed, equally controlled, and the way they moved suggested they were accustomed to violence. "We need a doctor," one of them said in heavily accented English. Zara stepped forward automatically. "I'm a nurse, but I can assess him while we wait for the attending physician." The injured man's eyes fixed on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of her exhaustion, her rumpled appearance, the coffee stain on her scrub top. His gaze was neither dismissive nor predatory, but evaluating, as if he was weighing something important about her character. "What happened?" Zara asked, guiding them toward an empty trauma bay. "Workplace accident," the injured man said, his English perfect but with a slight accent that suggested he had spent time in America. His voice was low, controlled, and somehow managed to convey both pain and authority. Zara had seen enough gunshot wounds during her rotations to recognize one immediately. This was no workplace accident unless his workplace involved people shooting at each other. But she had also learned not to ask questions when the answers might be dangerous. She helped him onto the examination table and began cutting away the bloodied suit jacket and shirt. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder, missing bone and major arteries by what looked like pure luck. Zara cleaned the wound efficiently, her movements steady despite the tremor in her hands that had been getting worse over the past week. "You need stitches, probably 15 on each side," she said. "Local anesthetic, antibiotic ointment, and you should have someone check for infection in 48 hours. The man watched her work with obvious approval. "You know what you're doing." "I've been doing this for 3 years, Zara replied, focusing on threading the needle. She had learned to keep conversations professional, especially with patients who arrived with mysterious injuries and expensive suits. As she began closing the entry wound, Zara felt the familiar lightheadedness that had been plaguing her for days. She paused, gripping the edge of the table until the dizziness passed. The man's dark eyes narrowed with what looked like concern. "When did you last eat something?" he asked quietly. "This morning," Zara lied. It had been yesterday morning, and even that had been a protein bar between classes. She finished the stitches with professional competence, bandaged the wounds, and provided aftercare instructions. The entire time, she was acutely aware of the man's continued scrutiny, the way he seemed to be memorizing details about her face, her movements, her obvious exhaustion. "What's your name?" he asked as she disposed of the medical waste. "Zara Williams." She didn't ask for his name in return. Some patients preferred anonymity, especially those who paid in cash and arrived with bodyguards. "Thank you, Zara Williams." His pronunciation of her name was careful, deliberate, as if he was committing it to memory. One of his associates stepped forward with an envelope thick enough to suggest cash payment. Hospital policy required her to direct them to billing, but before she could explain the procedure, the room began spinning. Zara tried to steady herself against the examination table, but her vision narrowed to a tunnel, her legs gave out, and she felt herself falling forward. Strong arms caught her before she hit the floor, and she found herself looking up into the dark, concerned eyes of the man she had just treated. "Get my doctor," he commanded one of his associates, his voice sharp with authority. "Now." "I'm fine," Zara mumbled, trying to pull herself upright. "I just need to sit down for a minute." "You're not fine," the man said firmly, lifting her easily and placing her on the examination table where he had been lying moments before. "When did you last sleep?" "Really sleep?" Zara couldn't remember. Days blurred together when you worked 3 jobs and attended classes and spent every free moment worrying about medical bills that grew faster than you could pay them. "Tuesday, maybe. Or Monday." The emergency department attending physician arrived, took one look at Zara, and began checking her pulse and blood pressure. "Dehydration, exhaustion, probably hasn't eaten in days," he muttered to no one in particular. "I need to finish my shift," Zara protested weakly. "Your shift is over," the Korean man said with quiet finality. He turned to the doctor. "What does she need?" "For fluids, rest, proper nutrition. She needs to sleep for about 12 hours and stop trying to work herself to death." Zara tried to sit up, but the room spun again and she fell back against the pillow. Her mother's treatment was scheduled for Friday. She couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't afford to be sick, couldn't afford to show weakness. The Korean man's hand touched her forehead gently, checking for fever. His fingers were surprisingly gentle for someone who had arrived with a gunshot wound and bodyguards. "Sleep," he said softly. "Everything else can wait." The last thing Zara remembered before consciousness faded was the feeling of safety, of being protected by someone who radiated both danger and careful tenderness. She didn't understand why this stranger was helping her, why his voice was so gentle, or why his presence made her feel more secure than she had in months. She only knew that for the first time in weeks, she was allowing herself to rest. Zara's eyes opened slowly, her mind struggling to process the unfamiliar surroundings. This wasn't the hospital break room, where she usually caught fragments of sleep between shifts. The ceiling above her was pristine white with recessed lighting that provided gentle, even illumination. The bed beneath her was impossibly comfortable, with Egyptian cotton sheets that felt more expensive than anything she had ever owned. Medical equipment hummed quietly nearby, but it was top of the line, the kind of monitoring systems she had only seen in the most exclusive private facilities. She turned her head carefully, taking in the spacious room around her. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a stunning view of Seoul's skyline, the city lights twinkling far below like scattered diamonds. The medical suite was larger than her entire apartment, decorated in calming shades of cream and soft gray, with artwork that looked original rather than mass-produced hospital prints. A private bathroom was visible through an open doorway, complete with marble surfaces and fixtures that gleamed under warm lighting. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from sleep. "You're safe," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Park Ji-won stepped into view, and Zara's memory came rushing back in fragmented pieces. The gunshot wound, his careful observation while she worked, the way she had collapsed into his arms when her body finally surrendered to exhaustion. He looked completely different now. Gone was the torn, bloodied suit, replaced by a charcoal gray ensemble that fit his frame perfectly. His shoulder was professionally bandaged beneath the crisp white shirt, but he moved with only the slightest hint of stiffness. His black hair was styled immaculately, his sharp features clean-shaven, and his dark eyes held the same intense focus she remembered from the emergency room. "How long was I unconscious?" Zara asked, struggling to sit up. 18 hours, he replied, moving closer to check the 4-line that was attached to her arm. "My doctor examined you thoroughly. Severe dehydration, exhaustion, and malnutrition. When did you last have a proper meal?" Zara tried to remember, but the days had blurred together in an endless cycle of work, classes, and worry. "I eat," she said defensively. "Protein bars and coffee don't constitute proper nutrition," Park Jae-won observed. His voice was matter-of-fact, not judgmental, but there was an underlying concern that surprised her. "My mother," Zara said suddenly, panic rising in her chest. "She was supposed to have her treatment consultation today. She'll be worried sick. I need to call her." "Already handled," he said calmly. "I had one of my people contact Seoul National Hospital. Your mother believes you're covering an emergency shift that will keep you busy for several days. She's not worried." "You had no right to do that," Zara said, anger flaring despite her gratitude. "You don't know anything about my situation or my family." "I know more than you might think," Park Jae-won replied, settling into the expensive leather chair beside her bed. His movements were controlled, predatory grace that suggested he was accustomed to having his authority questioned and dealing with it decisively. He reached for a tablet on the nearby table, swiping through what appeared to be a detailed file. Zara Williams, 24 years old, third-year nursing student at Seoul National University. Mother diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer 6 months ago. Father deceased when you were 16. No siblings. Current debt from medical expenses approximately $30,000 and growing. Working triple shifts to cover treatment costs while maintaining a 4.0 grade average. Zara stared at him, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the hospital gown she was wearing. "How did you get that information?" "I make it my business to know about people who interest me," he said simply. "And you, Zara Williams, are very interesting." She studied his face, looking for signs of the kind of predatory interest that made women disappear. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like respect, a careful evaluation that seemed to find her worthy rather than weak. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why do I interest you?" Park Jae-won leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Because in the 3 months I've been having my people treated at Seoul General, I've watched you work. I've seen you stay calm during trauma situations that make experienced doctors panic. I've watched you treat everyone with the same level of care, whether they're wealthy patients or homeless addicts. And I've never once seen you ask questions about injuries that were obviously not accidents." The implications of his words settled over her slowly. 3 months. He had been observing her for 3 months, watching her work, evaluating her character. She wasn't sure whether to be flattered or terrified. "Most people in your position would have demanded to know how I was injured," Park Jae-won continued. "They would have called security, involved the police, made my life considerably more complicated. But you treated the wound, provided professional care, and asked no questions about things that weren't your business." "Because it wasn't my business," Zara said. "My job is to provide medical care, not to judge people or make assumptions about their lives." "Exactly," he said, and she caught a glimpse of something that might have been approval in his expression. "That kind of discretion is rare and valuable." Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She was beginning to understand that this conversation was leading somewhere she might not want to go, but she was trapped in his medical facility, dependent on his hospitality, and acutely aware that he held all the power in this situation. "What do you want from me?" she asked directly. Park Jae-won stood and walked to the windows, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out at the city below. His penthouse was clearly in one of Seoul's most exclusive districts, the kind of building that required significant wealth just to gain access. "I run several businesses that occasionally require medical attention for my employees," he said carefully. "Industrial accidents, workplace injuries, situations where discretion is more important than official documentation. I need someone with your skills and your ethical standards." "You're talking about treating criminals," Zara said bluntly. "I'm talking about treating people who work in industries where official medical records can be problematic," he corrected. People who deserve competent care regardless of how they earn their living. Zara's mind raced through the implications. Everything about this man screamed wealth, power, and danger. The expensive suit, the private medical facility, the casual way he had gathered detailed information about her life, the gunshot wound that had brought them together. He was offering her something that was probably illegal, definitely dangerous, and absolutely necessary, given her current financial situation. "I can't," she said quietly. "I didn't become a nurse to help criminals avoid the consequences of their actions." Park Jiwon turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "Your mother's next treatment cycle costs $12,000. Insurance covers 60%. The balance is due Friday, or treatment will be delayed 2 weeks." Zara's breath caught in her throat. "How could you possibly know that?" "I told you. I make it my business to know about people who interest me. Your mother's oncologist is Dr. Kim Sung-min at Seoul Cancer Center. Excellent reputation, very expensive. The delay would likely be fatal given the aggressive nature of her particular cancer type." He was right, and they both knew it. 2 weeks without treatment would give the cancer time to spread, possibly beyond the point where any intervention would be effective. Zara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her chest. "Think about it," Park Jiwon said gently. "I'm not asking for an answer today, but your current situation is unsustainable. You're working yourself to death, your grades are suffering despite your intelligence, and your mother's medical bills will only continue to grow. I can solve all of those problems." "What would that cost me?" Zara asked, opening her eyes to meet his steady gaze. "Your discretion, your medical expertise, and your loyalty," he replied. "Nothing more than what you're already giving to a hospital system that pays you barely enough to survive." The offer hung between them like a lifeline that might also be a noose. Zara knew she was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life, and every direction led into unknown territory that terrified her. 2 hours later, after Zara had showered and eaten the first proper meal she'd had in days, Park Jiwon led her through his penthouse to a private office that spoke of serious business and unquestionable authority. The room was decorated in rich dark wood and supple black leather, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with volumes in Korean, English, and what appeared to be Japanese. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for a single manila folder, an expensive fountain pen, and a sleek black telephone. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seoul's financial district. The city's power centers spread out below like a map of influence and control. Everything in the room was expensive, tasteful, and designed to remind visitors that they were dealing with someone who commanded significant resources and respect. "Please, sit," Park Jiwon said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. His manner was formal now, professional, as if they were conducting legitimate business rather than a negotiation that could change the entire trajectory of her life. Zara settled into the chair, acutely aware of how the expensive leather seemed to embrace her tired body. Even the furniture in this room cost more than everything she owned combined. Park Jiwon moved around to the other side of the desk, his movements precise and controlled despite the shoulder injury that was still obviously causing him discomfort. "I'm going to be direct with you, Zara, because I believe you prefer honesty to polite deception," he began, opening the manila folder to reveal what appeared to be a formal contract. "I need a personal physician for my organization. Someone with your skills, your discretion, and your integrity." "What kind of organization?" Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I manage several import and export businesses throughout Asia," Park Jiwon replied smoothly. "Shipping, real estate development, private security services. Industries where workplace injuries can occur and where privacy is often more valuable than official documentation." It was a carefully worded description that revealed nothing while implying everything. Zara understood that she was being offered a position treating injuries sustained in activities that were almost certainly illegal, dangerous, and violent. "What exactly would my responsibilities include?" she asked. "You would provide medical care for members of my organization when they require treatment that cannot or should not be documented through official channels," Park Jiwon explained. "Emergency care, surgery when necessary, ongoing treatment for chronic conditions. You would maintain complete medical confidentiality and ask no questions about how injuries were sustained. He slid a document across the desk toward her. The compensation would be $200,000 per year, paid monthly in cash or transferred to accounts of your choosing. Your mother's cancer treatment would be covered completely, including experimental therapies not covered by insurance if they become necessary. Both of you would live here in my penthouse, in a private wing with your own medical facility, complete privacy, and 24-hour security. Zara stared at the figure on the contract, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what he was offering. $200,000 was more money than she had ever imagined earning, enough to eliminate her debt completely and provide her mother with the best possible care. What would you expect in return? She asked quietly. Absolute loyalty, Park Jae-won replied. Complete discretion about everything you see or hear while working for me. Availability when emergencies arise, regardless of the hour. And the understanding that once you accept this position, leaving my employment would be extremely difficult. The last statement carried the weight of a threat wrapped in professional language. Zara understood that she was being offered a position that might be lucrative and secure, but would also make her complicit in activities she couldn't know the full scope of. You're asking me to become a criminal, she said bluntly. I'm asking you to provide medical care to people who need it, Park Jae-won corrected. The same thing you do every day at the hospital, except better compensated and with patients who will treat you with considerably more respect than the ones who currently spit on you and threaten to report you for imaginary slights. His words hit closer to home than Zara wanted to admit. She had been assaulted by patients, verbally abused by entitled families, and treated like disposable help by doctors who saw nurses as glorified assistants rather than skilled professionals. What happens if I refuse? She asked. You return to your current life, Park Jae-won said simply. Your mother receives the treatment she's already scheduled for, funded by an anonymous donation that will cover this round only. You continue working triple shifts, falling further behind on bills, and watching her condition deteriorate while you exhaust yourself trying to save enough money to save her life. And if I accept, and then want to leave later? That would depend on the circumstances, he replied, his voice taking on a colder tone. People who betray my trust or compromise the security of my organization face permanent consequences. But those who serve loyally and honor their commitments are protected and rewarded. Zara stared at the contract, seeing her future laid out in precise legal language. The money was more than generous, enough to solve every financial problem she faced. The medical facilities would allow her to practice at the highest level, with equipment and resources she could only dream of accessing in a public hospital. Her mother would receive the best possible care without the constant worry about costs or insurance limitations. But accepting would mean crossing a line she had never intended to cross, becoming part of a world where violence was routine and her medical skills would be used to patch up criminals so they could return to whatever dangerous activities had injured them in the first place. I became a nurse to help people, she said quietly, to save lives and reduce suffering. What you're asking me to do contradicts everything I believe about medical ethics. Does it? Park Jae-won asked, leaning back in his chair. You would still be saving lives and reducing suffering. The only difference is that your patients would be people whose injuries cannot be treated through conventional channels. Are their lives worth less because of how they earn their living? It's not that simple, and you know it, Zara replied. If I help criminals avoid consequences for their actions, I become complicit in whatever violence they commit afterward. Park Jae-won studied her face for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. You're assuming that everyone who works for me is a violent criminal deserving of punishment. That's a naive perspective from someone who has spent months treating people whose injuries clearly resulted from activities that weren't entirely legal. Zara realized he was right. She had treated gunshot wounds, knife injuries, and blunt force trauma without asking questions or involving authorities. The only difference was that she had done it for free while struggling to keep her own life together. Your mother has perhaps 6 weeks without proper treatment, Park Jae-won continued quietly. Your current debt grows by approximately $1,500 every month in interest alone. At your current earning rate, accounting for living expenses, you will never eliminate the principal. Even if your mother survives this round of treatment, the next crisis will bankrupt you completely. The numbers were brutal and accurate. Zara had run the calculations herself late at night, when sleep eluded her and the weight of impossible mathematics pressed down like a physical force. She was trapped in a system designed to extract maximum profit from human suffering, and her attempts to play by the rules were slowly killing both her and her mother. "Think about what really matters," Park Ji-won said gently. "Your principles or your mother's life? Your moral purity or your ability to actually help people with resources and equipment that will make you a better nurse than you could ever be in an underfunded public hospital?" Zara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice settling into her bones. Everything he said was logical, practical, and completely at odds with the values she had built her entire identity around. But her mother was dying, her debt was insurmountable, and she was exhausting herself in pursuit of ideals that seemed increasingly meaningless when measured against cold financial reality. She opened her eyes and looked directly into Park Ji-won's steady gaze. "If I accept, how do I know you'll honor your commitments? How do I know this isn't just an elaborate way to trap me into something worse?" "Because you're valuable to me exactly as you are," he replied. "Intelligent, skilled, ethical, and discreet. Breaking that trust would eliminate everything that makes you useful. I have no interest in corrupting you, Zara. I need you to remain exactly who you are while working in a different environment." She looked down at the contract again, seeing her signature line waiting like a precipice. Signing would solve every practical problem she faced while creating new ones she couldn't fully anticipate. Refusing would preserve her moral integrity while almost certainly condemning her mother to death. Maybe morality was a luxury she could no longer afford. Maybe helping criminals survive their injuries was an acceptable compromise if it meant saving her mother's life and providing care that was competent rather than rushed. Maybe the world was more complicated than she had ever wanted to believe. Zara picked up the expensive fountain pen, feeling its weight in her fingers like a symbol of the choice she was making. "I accept," she said quietly, signing her name with careful, precise letters that seemed to seal her fate. Park Ji-won's expression showed what might have been relief mixed with satisfaction. "Welcome to my organization, Dr. Williams. Your first patient arrives tomorrow morning." 3 months later, Zara had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible when she was working triple shifts and surviving on protein bars in desperation. The private medical wing of Park Ji-won's penthouse had become her domain, a state-of-the-art facility that rivaled the best private hospitals in Seoul. She had equipment she had only dreamed of using, medications that cost more than her former monthly salary, and the kind of resources that made practicing medicine feel like an art form rather than a constant battle against insufficient supplies and impossible caseloads. Her mother sat in the comfortable chair beside the windows, reading a novel in Korean that she was slowly working through as part of her recovery therapy. The color had returned to her cheeks, her hair was growing back in soft silver curls, and her latest scans showed no trace of cancer. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, made possible by treatments that had cost more than Zara could have earned in 5 years. "You look tired, sweetheart," her mother observed, looking up from her book with the concerned expression that had become familiar over the past month. "I'm fine, Mom," Zara replied, checking the inventory on her medical supplies. She maintained detailed records of everything she used, both for practical reasons and because Park Ji-won had made it clear that accountability was essential in his organization. The routine had become manageable, even comfortable in some ways. Park Ji-won's men treated her with a respect she had never experienced in traditional medical settings. They said please and thank you, followed her instructions without argument, and never questioned her medical decisions. Most of their injuries were relatively minor: cuts that needed stitches, sprains that required wrapping, the occasional broken bone that needed setting and stabilization. She had learned not to ask how injuries occurred, not to comment on the expensive clothes that were often torn and bloodied, and certainly not to inquire about the nature of the business that led to such regular need for discreet medical care. The unspoken rules were simple: treat the injury, maintain confidentiality, and focus on the medical aspects rather than the circumstances. The emergency alarm in her medical facility buzzed at 2:15 in the morning, jolting Zara from the light sleep she had been catching between routine checkups. She rolled out of bed immediately, pulling on scrubs and rushing to the treatment room where Park Ji-won and 2 of his associates were carrying an unconscious man between them. The injured man was young, probably mid-20s, with multiple gunshot wounds to his chest and abdomen. Blood soaked through his expensive suit and pooled on the pristine floor of her treatment room. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his pulse weak and thready, and his skin had the grayish pallor that indicated significant blood loss. "How long ago was he shot?" Zara asked, immediately beginning her assessment while pulling on sterile gloves. 20 minutes, Park Jae-won replied tersely. "We brought him directly here." Zara worked quickly, cutting away the bloodied clothing to expose the wounds. 2 entry points in the chest, 1 in the upper abdomen, and what appeared to be a graze along his left arm. The chest wounds were her primary concern. Both appeared to have missed the heart, but one was dangerously close to the lung. "I need to operate immediately," she said, already moving to prepare the surgical instruments. "This is beyond what I can treat with basic emergency care." "Do what you need to do," Park Jae-won said, his voice carrying absolute authority. Zara had performed emergency surgery before during her hospital rotations, but never under these conditions, never with this level of responsibility resting entirely on her shoulders. She administered anesthesia, established 4 lines for blood replacement, and began the delicate process of repairing damage that could easily be fatal if she made any mistakes. Park Jae-won remained in the room throughout the procedure, observing silently from a position where he could see her work without interfering. His presence should have been distracting, but instead it felt oddly comforting, as if his confidence in her abilities somehow made her more capable of rising to meet the challenge. The first chest wound had damaged tissue but missed major organs. The second had nicked the lung, requiring careful suturing to prevent collapse. The abdominal wound was the most serious, having passed dangerously close to the liver before exiting through the back. Zara worked with steady hands and complete focus, each decision made with the kind of precision that came from years of training and months of working under pressure. For hours later, she finished closing the last incision and stepped back from the table, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. The patient was stable, his vital signs improved, and the immediate danger had passed. He would need careful monitoring for the next 48 hours, but he was going to live. "Excellent work," Park Jae-won said quietly, his voice carrying genuine admiration. Zara stripped off her surgical gloves and scrub gown, suddenly aware of how drained she felt. The adrenaline that had carried her through the emergency was fading, leaving behind the familiar exhaustion that reminded her of those impossible nights at Seoul General. "You should eat something," Park Jae-won observed, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she cleaned up. "I'm not hungry," Zara replied automatically, though she realized she couldn't remember when she had last eaten. "That wasn't a suggestion," he said firmly, disappearing from the treatment room and returning minutes later with a bowl of soup that smelled like comfort and warmth. "You don't have to take care of me," Zara protested, but accepted the bowl gratefully. "You just saved Lee Min-jun's life under conditions that would challenge surgeons with decades more experience than you have," Park Jae-won replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Taking care of you seems like an appropriate response." There was something different in his manner, a gentleness that she hadn't seen before. He watched her eat with the same careful attention he paid to everything else, but there was concern in his expression rather than the calculating assessment she was accustomed to. "Does this happen often?" Zara asked quietly. "People getting shot, I mean." "More often than I would prefer," Park Jae-won admitted. "My business involves managing territory and resources that others sometimes want to claim for themselves. Conflict is unfortunately inevitable." It was the most direct he had ever been about the nature of his work, and Zara appreciated the honesty even as it confirmed her suspicions about the violence that surrounded his organization. "I became a nurse to save lives," she said, staring into the bowl of soup. "I didn't expect to be patching up people so they could go back to situations where they might get shot again." "Do you regret your decision?" Park Jae-won asked. Zara thought about her mother, sleeping peacefully in the comfortable bedroom down the hall, free from pain and fear for the first time in months. She thought about the medical equipment that allowed her to practice at the highest level, the respect she received from patients who valued her expertise, and the financial security that had eliminated the constant stress of impossible choices. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. But sometimes I wonder what it's costing me that I can't see yet." Park Jae-won leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes serious. What do you think it's costing you? My ideals, maybe. My belief that the world is simpler than it actually is. The certainty I used to have about right and wrong. Those things have value, he acknowledged. But so does your mother's life. So does your ability to practice medicine with proper resources. So does being treated with respect rather than being seen as disposable help. Zara finished the soup, feeling warmth spread through her exhausted body. There was something deeply comforting about being cared for by someone who understood the weight of what she had just accomplished, who recognized that saving a life was significant regardless of the circumstances. Thank you, she said quietly. For the soup, Park Jae-won asked. For understanding what tonight meant, Zara replied. For trusting me with something this important. He stood and collected the empty bowl, his movements careful and considerate. You've earned that trust, Zara. Tonight proved that my confidence in your abilities was justified. As he moved toward the door, Zara felt an unexpected reluctance to be alone with her thoughts and the weight of what she had just experienced. The medical emergency had been a test of her skills, but it had also been something more personal, a moment when Park Jae-won had relied on her completely, and she had proven worthy of that faith. The boundaries between professional obligation and personal connection were beginning to blur in ways that both comforted and concerned her. 2 weeks after the emergency surgery, Zara found herself sharing late evening meals with Park Jae-won more often than their professional relationship strictly required. Tonight he had appeared in her medical facility with takeout from an expensive Korean restaurant, settling into the chair across from her desk, as if their dinner conversations had become routine rather than unexpected intimacy. The walls between them had been shifting gradually, conversations moving beyond medical reports and operational details towards something more personal. Zara had begun to notice things about him that had nothing to do with his authority or wealth. The way he listened with complete attention when she spoke, his unexpected knowledge of classical music, the careful way he moved when he thought his shoulder injury was bothering him. You've been working too late again, Park Jae-won observed, noting the medical journals spread across her desk and the empty coffee cup that indicated she had been reading for hours. Lee Min-jun's recovery has been faster than expected, Zara replied, closing the trauma surgery textbook she had been reviewing. I wanted to understand the long-term implications of the procedures I performed. His recovery is excellent because your work was excellent, Park Jae-won said firmly. You don't need to second-guess every decision you made under pressure. There was something different in his tone tonight, a weight that suggested more than professional concern. Zara looked up from her notes to find him staring out the window at the city lights below, his expression uncharacteristically distant. Is everything all right? She asked quietly. Park Jae-won was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting something that looked almost like pain. I had a sister, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. Younger than me by 8 years. Her name was Park Jae-hye. The past tense registered immediately, and Zara felt her chest tighten with intuitive understanding. What happened to her? She was 22 when she died, Park Jae-won continued, still staring out at the city. Sweet, intelligent, everything good in a world that's mostly dark. She wanted to be a teacher, believed she could make a difference in children's lives. I was building my empire then, too focused on power and territory to pay attention to the people who actually mattered. He turned back to face Zara, and she saw vulnerability in his expression that she had never witnessed before. The controlled intensity was still there, but underneath it was grief that had clearly never fully healed. She was walking home from her university library one evening when she was attacked by 3 men, Park Jae-won said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They stabbed her multiple times and left her bleeding in an alley. By the time someone found her and called for help, she had lost too much blood. The public hospital was overcrowded, understaffed, and equipped with outdated emergency facilities. Zara's heart clenched as she began to understand where this story was leading. She could have been saved, she said softly. Easily, Park Jae-won confirmed. The wounds weren't immediately fatal. With proper emergency care, adequate blood supplies, and competent trauma surgery, she would have survived. But the hospital was dealing with a shortage of surgical staff, their blood bank was critically low, and the equipment they had was insufficient for the complexity of her injuries. He stood and moved to the window again, his hands clasped behind his back in the controlled posture that Zara now recognized as his way of managing intense emotion. I arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after she was admitted. She was conscious, asking for me, telling the nurses she needed to see her brother. But I was in a meeting with suppliers, negotiating contracts that seemed important at the time. The guilt in his voice was devastating. Zara could see how this tragedy had shaped everything about him, from his meticulously controlled environment to his need for perfect medical facilities to his protective instincts that seemed almost compulsive. By the time I reached her bedside, she was unconscious from blood loss. Park Jae-won continued. She died 6 hours later because the trauma surgeon was handling 3 other critical patients simultaneously and didn't have the resources to give her the attention she needed. I held her hand while machines that should have been keeping her alive failed one by one. Zara felt tears forming in her eyes as she imagined Park Jae-won as a younger man, watching his sister die from injuries that should have been treatable, understanding that his priorities had been catastrophically wrong when they mattered most. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to offer some acknowledgement of his loss. "That's why I built this," Park Jae-won said, gesturing to encompass the medical facility around them. "Not just for my organization, but as a promise to her. No one I care about will ever die from treatable injuries because I failed to provide proper medical resources." Zara suddenly understood so much about their arrangement that had puzzled her before. His insistence on the best possible equipment, his willingness to pay extraordinary salaries for competent medical care, his protective behavior that went far beyond reasonable business precautions. He wasn't just running a criminal organization. He was trying to atone for a failure that had cost him the person he loved most. She wasn't just his medic, she realized. She was his redemption, his way of saving the sister he had lost, his attempt to ensure that medical competence and resources would always be available when they were desperately needed. "You remind me of her sometimes," Park Jae-won said quietly, turning back to face Zara. "The dedication, the belief that helping people is worth any sacrifice. She would have liked you." Before Zara could respond, the secure telephone in her medical facility rang with the particular tone that indicated an emergency call from outside the organization. Park Jae-won answered immediately, his manner shifting instantly to cold authority. "What happened?" he said into the receiver, listening to whoever was speaking on the other end. His expression grew increasingly dark, and Zara felt a chill of premonition settle into her bones. "Where is she now?" Park Jae-won demanded. "Are you certain she's safe?" "Good. Maintain surveillance and report any changes immediately." He hung up and turned to Zara with an expression that combined fury and protective determination. "Your mother was approached by 3 men at Seoul Cancer Center this afternoon. They claimed to be insurance investigators, but their identification was fraudulent. Hospital security intervened before they could take her anywhere, but they made it clear they know who she is and where to find her." Zara's blood turned cold. The protected world they had built suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable to threats she hadn't fully considered. Her mother, the reason she had accepted this arrangement, was now in danger because of choices Zara had made. "Who were they?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would terrify her. "The Choi Syndicate," Park Jae-won replied grimly. "They've been testing my organization's weaknesses, looking for leverage they can use against me. Apparently, they've identified you as someone whose safety matters to me." The implications hit Zara like a physical blow. She had become important enough to Park Jae-won that his enemies saw her as a viable target. Her mother's life was in danger because rival criminals had recognized that Zara meant something beyond professional value to the man who protected them. "What do we do?" she asked, fighting panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. "We eliminate the threat permanently," Park Jae-won said with cold finality. "And we move your mother here, where she'll be under constant protection." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of controlled violence and protective measures that Zara experienced secondhand through terse phone calls and grim reports. Park Jae-won disappeared for most of the day, returning only to provide updates that grew increasingly definitive. The Choi Syndicate was being systematically dismantled. Their leadership was being eliminated. Their operations were being absorbed or destroyed. Zara's mother arrived at the penthouse that evening, shaken but safe, accompanied by security personnel who treated her with the same careful respect they showed Zara. The private medical wing was expanded to include comfortable living quarters that would allow her mother to remain under protection indefinitely. That night, as Zara sat in the chair beside her mother's bed watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in days, Park Ji-won appeared in the doorway. His expensive suit was rumpled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and there was something in his expression that looked like exhaustion mixed with relief. "Is it over?" Zara asked quietly. "Yes," he confirmed. "The threat has been eliminated permanently. No one will use your family to get to me again." Zara stood and moved toward him, suddenly overwhelmed by gratitude and something deeper that she was only beginning to recognize. This man had waged war against an entire criminal organization because they had threatened her mother. He had eliminated threats with efficiency that was both terrifying and deeply comforting. "Thank you," she whispered, and without thinking about professional boundaries or appropriate behavior, she stepped into his arms. Park Ji-won held her carefully, as if she were something precious that might break under too much pressure. The controlled intensity that defined him seemed to soften as she pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the warmth of his body against hers. "You don't need to thank me," he murmured against her hair. "Protecting you isn't a favor I'm doing for you. It's something I need to do for myself." Zara looked up into his dark eyes and saw the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She was no longer just grateful for his protection or impressed by his competence. She was falling in love with Park Ji-won, the dangerous man who had shown her gentleness, the criminal who had saved her mother's life, the leader who had made her feel valued and protected in ways she had never experienced before. When he kissed her, soft and careful and full of restrained intensity, Zara understood that they had crossed a line that would change everything between them. This was no longer about medical arrangements or financial necessity. This was about two people who had found something precious in each other despite circumstances that should have made love impossible. She fell asleep in his arms that night, feeling safe and cherished and completely certain that whatever came next, she belonged exactly where she was. The elimination of the Choi Syndicate had taken 3 days of systematic violence that Park Ji-won handled with the same controlled efficiency he applied to everything else in his carefully ordered world. But when he returned to the penthouse after ensuring that every threat had been permanently neutralized, Zara could see that something fundamental had shifted in his manner toward her. He found her in the medical facility, checking on Lee Min-jun's continued recovery, her movements automatic as she updated charts and verified medication schedules. The routine tasks provided comfort after days of fear and uncertainty, but she was acutely aware of Park Ji-won's presence the moment he appeared in the doorway. "How is your mother settling in?" he asked, though his tone suggested the question was merely a pretext for a conversation that would cover more significant territory. "She's comfortable," Zara replied, not looking up from the medical charts. "She likes the view from her new room, and she's already planning to redecorate if you'll allow it." "Of course," Park Ji-won said, moving closer until he was standing directly beside her. "This is her home now, for as long as she wants it to be." The word home carried weight that had nothing to do with temporary arrangements or professional obligations. Zara finally looked up to meet his dark eyes and found an intensity there that made her breath catch in her throat. "Zara," he said quietly, reaching out to touch her face with fingers that were surprisingly gentle despite the violence they had undoubtedly committed over the past 3 days. "What happened this week changed everything for me. Not just the threat, but my response to it. The way I felt when I realized someone was trying to hurt you through your mother." She leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his palm against her cheek and the steady strength that had become her anchor in a world that was far more dangerous and complex than she had ever imagined. "I nearly declared war on half of Seoul," Park Ji-won continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I was prepared to destroy anyone and everyone who might pose even a theoretical threat to your safety. That's not rational business strategy, Zara. That's something much more personal." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes and smell the expensive cologne that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. His other hand came up to frame her face, holding her gently but firmly, as if she were something precious that required careful protection. "You're mine, Zara," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Not as my employee, not because of our arrangement, Not because you owe me anything. Mine because I can't breathe properly when you're in danger. Mine because watching you work, seeing your dedication and competence and compassion has become necessary for my sanity. Mine because I'm completely and irrevocably in love with you. The declaration hit her with force that was both overwhelming and deeply satisfying, as if she had been waiting to hear those exact words without realizing how much she needed them. Everything about their relationship suddenly made sense. His protective behavior, the way he watched her work with such focused attention, the gradual shift from professional respect to personal devotion. "And you're mine," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Mine despite the danger, despite the world you live in, despite everything that should terrify me about falling in love with you. Broken pieces, violent history, and all." Park Ji-won's control finally cracked, and he kissed her with desperate intensity that spoke of weeks of restrained desire and carefully suppressed emotion. Zara responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck as she pressed herself against the solid warmth of his body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Park Ji-won rested his forehead against hers and spoke in a voice rough with emotion. "Marry me, Zara." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a command either. It was a request wrapped in certainty, an offer made by someone who already knew what her answer would be because they had moved beyond the point where any other future was possible. "Yes," she whispered, and felt something settle into place in her chest that she hadn't realized was missing. Over the following weeks, Park Ji-won transformed from protective employer to devoted partner with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to all his endeavors. He consulted Zara on business decisions that affected the medical aspects of his organization. He began transitioning some of his operations toward legitimate medical ventures, acquiring hospitals and research facilities that would allow her to practice medicine at the highest levels while remaining within his protected sphere. The wedding ceremony took place in the penthouse's main living area, transformed into an elegant space filled with flowers that Zara's mother had selected personally. The guest list was small and carefully curated. Zara's mother, several of Park Ji-won's most trusted associates, and the doctor who had overseen her mother's cancer treatment and had become something like family during the months of crisis. Zara's mother had not only given her blessing to the union, but had embraced Park Ji-won with the warmth she reserved for people who proved their devotion through actions rather than words. She had seen how he cared for Zara, how he had eliminated threats to protect their family, how he made her daughter feel valued and cherished in ways that transcended financial security. The ceremony itself was conducted by a judge who owed Park Ji-won enough favors to ensure both discretion and legitimacy. Zara wore a dress that managed to be both elegant and practical, chosen specifically because it allowed her to move freely while looking appropriate for the most important day of her life. When Park Ji-won spoke his vows, his voice was steady and filled with the same controlled intensity that defined everything he did. "I promise to protect you, to value your intelligence and independence, to support your dreams even when they challenge my understanding of the world. I promise to never let fear or pride prevent me from showing you exactly how much you mean to me." Zara's vows were equally direct. "I promise to stand beside you even when your world is dangerous, to use my skills to protect the people you care about, to love you completely while maintaining the integrity that made you respect me in the first place. I promise to be your partner, not just your protected treasure." When they kissed to seal their marriage, Zara felt the same sense of rightness that had overwhelmed her the night he first held her through her fears about her mother's safety. This was where she belonged, in the arms of a man who had shown her that love could be both gentle and fierce, that protection could coexist with respect, that moral complexity was the price of living authentically in an imperfect world. The reception was intimate and comfortable, filled with quiet conversation and genuine affection from the people who had witnessed their unlikely journey from professional arrangement to devoted partnership. Park Ji-won never left her side, his hand finding hers automatically whenever they were separated even briefly. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Zara found herself alone with her new husband in the penthouse that had become their shared home. The city lights sparkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the medical facility where they had first begun to understand each other was quiet and peaceful. "Someone tell me this isn't real," Zara whispered against Park Ji-won's chest as he held her close on the sofa where they had shared so many late evening conversations. "It's real," he replied, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction and absolute certainty. "You're safe, you're loved, you're exactly where you belong. You're mine, and I'm yours, and nothing in this world will ever change that." Zara closed her eyes and allowed herself to fully accept the truth of their transformation. She had walked into Seoul General Hospital as an exhausted nursing student drowning in debt and desperation. She was ending this chapter of her life as a cherished wife, a skilled medical professional with unlimited resources, and a woman who had found her home in the most unexpected place imaginable. The girl who had collapsed from exhaustion in a stranger's arms 6 months ago would never have believed this ending was possible. But the woman she had become understood that sometimes the most profound love grew from the most unlikely circumstances, that sometimes accepting help from dangerous people led to the safest place in the world, and that sometimes the best way to save lives was to let someone else save yours first. In Park Ji-won's arms, surrounded by the luxury and security he had built around their love, Zara finally allowed herself to rest completely. She was exactly where she was meant to be.